PCS because I work at PCS, so that's true, but I'm not in here in a PCS capacity.
Allegedly.
Well, my boss is sitting here, so I have to be careful what I'm saying. But yeah, so I'm actually here just as an activist, but also I'm speaking another session actually representing CND as well. So yeah, just to make clear, I'm not speaking in a PCS capacity. So thanks for coming along to this session. It is a round table, so I'm quite pleased we've got this square set up at least. So we're going to try and avoid just doing sort of presentations, Q&A. We obviously want to have a round table to get some discussion. However, that said, we have got 5, I think it is, key contributors in the room. So Sarah and John and Liz, who you've hopefully all heard from already. And we've got Levidow as well from UCU, and Jenny right down the end of the table, who used to work for Yorkshire and Humber TUC, and is a climate activist as well, and will be bringing some reflections from her perspectives, and particularly from a regional perspective, which is really important. So what we're going to do is the contributors have been given a couple of questions to answer, basically, obviously in line with the title of the workshop, which is about the National Climate Service and why markets can't deliver. So I'm just going to say very quickly a couple of things about that. Those of you who've been around a long time and are familiar with the 1 Million Climate Jobs campaign, which was launched in 2008, 2009 in response to the economic and climate crisis at that time, will be aware that one of the demands of the 1 Million Jobs campaign was about having a national climate service, and this was to be, the idea is modelled on the idea of the NHS, clearly as it was founded in 1948, not where we're at today. But we're having a government service, a government jobs that could deliver on what we need to do to take action on climate change. Now, over the years, we've always talked about it, but we've never actually really articulated what do we mean by this, what would it look like in reality. So this is what we're trying to do now, is actually develop the concept and proposal for this as a very practical action, not just kind of theoretical or thing that we want to do, but something we can be industrially fighting for as well. But obviously that's not just about one union, that's about all trade unions, but also that's about allies as well across the labour movement and the climate justice movement as well. So it's not just the premise of one body. Now PCS has started to do some work to take this forward and produced this pamphlet, which I can circulate around to give you a bit of an idea of some of the thinking. But obviously, John will address some of these things in more detail. So what we're going to start off with, though, is just the first kind of question, and I will start with John. Obviously, he's from sort of PCS and is taking the lead and doing some work on this. It's just to give no more than 5 minutes on why we need to look at beyond the market basis of a just transition, centred on what we often hear about, green growth and market signals leading things, and how we need to modify institutions to fit with this narrative rather than challenging this logic. So I will start with John.
Cheers, thank you, and thank you for inviting me here. The irony is that if you were a market fundamentalist, you could make the argument that actually the market, or so-called market, is ignoring price signals. In theory, if you believe in these things, where the market shows increasing costs and what have you, and you've got an alternative, cheaper sort of method of delivering the same thing, in theory, all the money should go to the cheaper thing, and the cheaper thing should drive out the dearer thing. But in reality, that hasn't happened in this country. Now, first of all, I think we all know that markets are not some spontaneous things that come into existence. Certainly for the last several hundred years, markets have always operated within a framework of state either regulation or state control or state direction. There is no market I know in the world, apart from possibly you might market the drug market, but then even then you could argue there is state regulation, state direction, etc., that actually is free of the state. And certainly when we look at the energy markets of this country, for instance, as an example, the state actually designed these markets. So they're not spontaneous. We had a different alternative before, which was a state-run market of state corporations, and it was a political choice to actually privatise those things and create the market we have. Now, the price signals are also very weird in this country in terms of energy, is they're not set by the cheapest energy provider, they're set by the highest energy provider. So if you've got some deeply inefficient means of delivering electricity, actually that determines the nature of the cost to the market rather than the cheaper renewable fuels, etc. and what have you. So I think we should actually be honest about markets and market signals, etc. They're not some sort of like impersonal signals. They are directly derived from a state architecture, and the fact that we've actually suffered very high energy costs over the last few years is because the way the market was actually derived. The dash for gash in the past, which was a political decision. It wasn't a market decision. The fact of that we rely upon external oil production, that is a decision made by past governments. Past governments could have done a dash for renewables. They didn't. They deliberately decided not to. Partly the Conservatives because they didn't believe in it, partly because the Labour Party didn't push for it. In other words, what energy mix we have is because of political decisions. So if it's a political decision, then we can have other political decisions and therefore have, if you like, other markets where the state, in my opinion, has to be the directive force. I cannot see it unless we literally just say tomorrow is the lowest price determines electricity, but even then you would gain it because of the big corporations that dominate the market, how we can actually move from a model of nuclear fuel, and obviously I know there is a big discussion in the Green Movement about the role of nuclear fuel, but certainly I don't think there's any argument about gas, coal and oil production, to one where we are literally net zero. And the only way I can see it, and certainly my union, is through a radical change of the energy markets, in fact the economy. Therefore, certainly my union's policy is around a democratic ownership of certainly the energy companies and certainly in transport, in other words the big producers, the big polluters. Because it's only there, and as I said, all we're talking about is a different choice, a different choice from the state. The state at the moment has this particular choice in the energy market. We want to go to a different one where democratically people do control the energy markets. Now, certainly in our conception, and I'll start to come to an end because I know I've only got 5 minutes, it is we don't see that as just being, you know, the big energy corporation is, or the big generators, that somehow we just cross the letter out and just say private, public, and it's literally exactly the same. And that's what actually nationalisation was. When Labour took over the companies after the Second World War, it just replicated what they were. I'm looking for a much more popular mixture where people can democratically change very quickly. I mean, some of the models actually have been tried in America, where, for instance, if energy utilities want to put up prices, they have to publicly consult it and actually literally have to persuade at least part of the public that they have to do that. They have to go to an open forum, present all their costs, and in theory, people can vote veto actually in price increases, etc. And certainly that's the model I would look for. So just very, very quickly, I want a different type of market. I don't think we're actually meddling with the market in the way that somehow right-wingers claim, because right-wingers, if they were honest to themselves, and lots of right-wingers are so ideologically deformed, they can't actually see the wood for the trees, actually would have to admit that the markets we have now are state-driven. We just want a different type of market, one that's democratically controlled, but one that literally has as its aim just transformation to move from where we are to net zero, but do it in a way that's not harmful to workers, that generally drives down costs and generally is compatible with the new society that I think all of us here in this room want to get to. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. Yeah, we're just going to hear from all the contributors, and then we'll have an opportunity for people to come in with comments and questions as well, a bit of discussion, and then we'll go to the next section. So I'm going to hand over to Liz next, obviously coming from a sort of more local authority, local government perspective. There's no right. Well, you don't have to. You don't have to. You can do what you want.
I mean, because the question, do we need to look beyond the market? I was tempted to say I don't need 5 minutes. I'm just going to say Liz Truss. And, the experience of her as Prime Minister summed up everything that was wrong with it, really. But, of course, I think we do need to have a bit more of an analysis of it. And actually, John and I didn't have time to talk about what we were going to say in advance, but it kind of follows on quite well from that, because I was going to talk a little bit about the ideology of the market as well, and why we need to try and break from that. Because, of course, that, throughout however many years, we've had the Tories, with Thatcher saying things like there's no such thing as society, and that whole ethos of everybody can make it, and it's all about what you do, and that there is a free market that's leaving everything out in society. It's been a really dominant ideology. That ideology really has been central to modern capitalism. And of course, we are all meant to believe that supply and demand can miraculously match each other, that wealth will trickle down to all of society, and that investment and spending are what aids economic growth. But of course that isn't what the market does at all, is it? Rather than being a mechanism for distributing resources and developing society, really what it's about is accumulating wealth and concentrating more and more of it into fewer hands, companies, organisations, countries, and all the rest of it. And of course, to accumulate that wealth, development and investment are needed, but also competition, and between those vying to have the most wealth. And this means that although at various points there's some dynamism, the competitive nature of the market economies means that in the long term profits are going to decline and crises will happen and will get built into the system. Now, I mean, obviously that is like a 30-second really superficial overview of markets and what they do. But I think even that little snapshot can really highlight why we can't leave solving the climate emergency and developing a national climate service to that ideological sort of bent of a free market. But of course, left to their own devices, that's what politicians ideally would like to do, but it's certainly what they use to justify what they do. That like John was talking about. We all know the Tories love a free market, and that is why they hate funding public services actually, because they don't create any wealth out of us. My substantive role as a housing officer, I don't create wealth. I make sure that people have somewhere safe and warm and affordable to live, which sums up everything that the Tories hate. That and I suppose a visceral greed really that means they resent every penny that isn't their profit. But actually, it's been an ideology that Labour's stuck to as well. And that's why, when they've talked about, on the one hand, having, green economic growth, it's all been framed around the market. But it's also why they'll then turn around, Starmer will turn around and say, actually, we're going to have to roll back on that pledge because we're not going to have the money to do it. We're not going to have the resources to do it. It's still looking at the market economy and the market deciding on everything, it being market forces, and that is how they framework anything, anything in general in society, but also about how they would address the climate emergency. And I think there's many problems to that approach as well. First of all, it accepts that there isn't enough money, doesn't it? That there's something that has to be shared around, or there isn't enough money for our class, for our side. There's always that desire for more and more money for them. But also, it's just not true. That simply isn't true. There's a huge amount of wealth in society, both globally and nationally. I looked some of this up. There's more billionaires than ever before globally. The world's richest person is now Bernard Arnault, who I may mispronounce, but he holds the majority holding of LVMH, which we might be more familiar with as being Louis Vuitton. And he's got an estimated fortune of $233 billion, which is a 10% increase from last year. That's why he's outstripped Elon Musk and Bezos at Amazon. But also that's replicated in this country, the UK. The 10 richest people have got a combined fortune of £207.8 billion. The FTSE 100 companies made over £250 billion, of which £85 billion was paid in dividends to shareholders in 2023. So, they've done nothing to recover £10 billion fraudulently claimed by companies in the COVID recovery fund. And had those, those companies been properly taxed over the last 3 decades, then actually there will be plenty of funding for public services and plenty of funding for trying to address it. And that's even in, you know, basic sort of Keynesianism approach to where there's having money in society, but funding to address the climate emergency. But that, of course, none of this will happen if you don't have the planning and decisions. You know, without that, the world that we're living in now is what happens, that the rich is getting richer at our expense and at the expense of our planet. So actually, the question of planning is fundamentally important, I think. And, you know, that's because where resources go, as I say, won't come about through the market, but because through planning you actually can make decisions about alternative energy, about training for climate jobs, about how services are run, and actually about what the priorities in society are. So I think rather than shaping and limiting the possibilities in society and in addressing the climate emergency by starting with the market and green growth, I think actually we have to flip that right over. So the starting point is what's needed to urgently address the climate emergency, and you start looking at how that's brought about, how that's coordinated and brought out to be into being, which I think leads you into, you know, things like having a planning, organised approach and the proper funding of something like a National Climate Service, which is certainly we've picked up from the PCS and are including in our motion that's going to our national conference to support and work with them over. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Liz. Okay, next, Les, I'm going to come to you.
Okay.
That's all right. And just to say, Les Levidow is from UCU and the Climate and Ecological Emergency Committee.
Yes, thanks to the organisers, well, especially Sam, for sending the invitation to UCU, which was then passed on to the committee, and I volunteered to give a presentation which goes beyond anything in UCU policy or is a solution. State coercion to close markets and natural resources and exploit labor. Protests demanded protection of the commons. Rulers dismissed such demands as interference in the market and thus an illegitimate constraint on wealth creation. Sounds familiar? Well, let's fast forward 2 or 3 centuries to the neoliberal agenda from the 1980s onwards. This attacked the labor movement's gains over previous decades by dismantling public goods, public services, and commons of more kinds than in the 18th century. For what aim? To create new markets through and for coercion, throwing people into greater competition with each other for employment, and turning potentially all natural resources into commodities. In response to environmental protest, the ruling elite elaborated a neoliberal environmentalism, whereby new market incentives would supposedly protect resources while also using them productively for wealth creation. Since the Kyoto Protocol, a carbon trading market has awarded carbon credits to projects which supposedly avoid carbon emissions, which would otherwise happen, yet many of these projects cause more environmental harm and/or land enclosures. As a more ambitious neoliberal agenda, green growth imagines that market incentives will generate techno-scientific advance, reconciling economic growth with resource conservation and low carbon emissions. New techniques would provide more efficient ways to extract resources and convert them into energy or products, such as renewable energy or low-carbon fuel. The future promise of low-carbon efficiency has justified enormous subsidies to corporations. Meanwhile, the environmental benefits have been doubtful or minimal. If you want to know more, see the CAT2 brochure on greenwashing fossil fuels. In practice, greater productive efficiency has provided a financial incentive for extending resource extraction and use, while also minimizing dependence on skilled labor, and so driving down wages and conditions. So the capitalist remedy strengthens the political economic forces which have created climate injustice. To the extent that green growth happens, it concentrates wealth in the few, still dependent on global labor exploitation and resource extraction. Thus, it's an unjust transition, if a transition at all. Despite the state's market incentives for renewable energy, fossil extraction has continued to expand and will do so for the foreseeable future. It has at least 3 or 4 drivers: its greater profitability, the price signals, which are set by the most expensive extraction, as John mentioned, the general increase in energy usage, and fossil fuel subsidies. All of these shape the so-called market. Let's look at the official opposition. The Labour Party plans a great British energy company to expand renewable energy, but this may achieve little decarbonisation for several reasons. Fossil fuels will continue to rise along with energy usage. Connecting new sources of renewable energy to the grid can wait 10 or 15 years if left to the big sis energy companies, in other words, the market, as structured by the British state. By contrast, a just transition would need several elements: public ownership of utilities, especially the electricity distribution, public goods encouraging cooperative activities, including social care, and lower resource burdens, replacing some individual consumption, lower energy usage across entire supply chains through a transformation within and across sectors, and most importantly, institutional capacities to design and implement such changes. All of this would be a task for a new state body, or perhaps several, at national, regional, and local level, to restructure markets as a means to generate those new institutions and incentives, especially through public procurement rules. I'll say more about this in the next round.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ross. Right, I'm now going to hand over to Sarah, and then Jenny will come in at the end.
So I'm just going to throw it out there. I found the second question easier to answer than the first question, and I've sat here listening to the contributions thinking, I think I've looked at this in a different perspective, but I'm just going to throw it out there. I based my kind of answer on what actually does a just transition mean, and what we talk about it as trade unionists, and what that means to us and our members. And it's definitely, that the priority is advocating for the rights and well-being of workers, particularly in the context of transitions towards sustainability and green growth. And whilst we do, for all the points that have already been raised, we acknowledge the impact of the current way that the market's structured and the economic incentives that are out there, although it's interestingly not so many in the food industry, in driving the transition for the markets and for the better of the markets. And it's imperative that we centre our efforts in ensuring that workers are not left behind in any of those changes, but also that transition is equitable for all, including those in the global south that we can't necessarily see every day, but are very much a part of our global supply chains. And look at our alternatives that have been touched on by the other speakers, kind of fit into that narrative. I kind of put, we need guaranteed decent jobs, job security, opportunities for retraining and upskilling those affected by shifts in industries, and all of those are going to impact the market. We appreciate, and green jobs can offer new avenues for employment, but we've got to ensure that those jobs are accessible to all workers, and have decent working conditions, because what we can't have is a repeat of what happened in the 80s when the mines closed. That was a requirement, but we don't want that to be repeated. We've got to make sure that when we're talking about markets and growth and modifying institutions, that we've got to recognise the disproportionate impact of climate change and environmental degradation on communities in the global south. They're already bearing the brunt of the crisis, despite, as we heard this morning, contributing the least to it. And any industry's just transition strategy, we should be at the forefront in inputting into that. They've got to recognise that impact on those communities, and including those strategies, providing support for adaptation and resilience resilience building efforts, as well as addressing the root cause of environmental injustice and exploitation. And you know, institutional reforms are crucial in this regard. I think we have to modify institutions to fit the narrative, but we also need to be challenging the logic behind their thought processes as well. We've got to empower workers and communities to participate in decision-making processes in democratic structures, as has been mentioned, but they've also got to be able to shape the direction of their economies as well, you know, ours and around the world. And this may include, you know, measures such as strengthening employment rights, but also promoting cooperative ownership models. We've talked about nationalisation in democratic structures, but that includes worker cooperatives too, unionised ones at that. Ensuring that any trade agreements prioritise social and environmental standards over corporate interests, and making sure that a just transition in any market is not confined just to national borders. I will leave it as that. As I said, I was more comfortable with the second question.
That's absolutely fine. It's not an academic exercise, so I'm not going to be marking you. No, that was brilliant. I think, you know, to bring in a different perspective and bring that back down is also what's needed as part of that whole sort of political education stuff around as well. So over to Jenny.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so my experience as an activist with trade unions and around climate has been a lot in the region of Yorkshire and Humber and my city of Sheffield. So that's the kind of lens that I'm bringing to this, to sort of add to some of the points that have already been made, really. Yeah, I've been researching that and trade unions and their concerns and their capacity to act on climate change, so that will come out more in the next section, probably. And I've got 5 sort of reasons, or you know, that we need a national climate service as opposed to just leaving things to the market. So one is like, and these aren't really in order of importance; they're just sort of the order that it's lovely to talk about them. So recognising inequality between regions. We've got in our country, we've got a hugely unequal economy in terms of, you know, regionally the different effects. You know, London sucks a lot of the economic power out of the economy, and regions like Yorkshire and Humber, or you could look at Wales or Scotland, Northern Ireland as well, have actually really suffered and become very unequal. You know, they've got less investment, they've got less productivity, they've got less skills, they've got less pay. You know, as Sarah mentioned about the need for a pay rise, the Sheffield Peter pay rise campaign. You know, these things are all well documented, and they are quite shocking when you look at the scale of them. And climate action and acting on, you know, having a national climate service actually, so we need a national climate service. We need to start thinking about things as a national approach, but that really built into it needs to actually look at those regional inequalities and how actually acting on climate can dig us out of that hole we're in and actually help those regions and nations that you know have been left behind. So I think climate action is a way forward, investing in the right things instead of investing in the wrong things, and doing it at the right scale. So the other thing that I think the National Climate Service can help us with is actually a shift to focusing on the economy in a different way. So thinking about the everyday economy, basic services, so the things that we need in our everyday lives, such as transport, homes and food. And they're really at the key of a lot of climate changes that need to happen. Whereas what's often happened, and I know when I sit on various boards in Sheffield and even wider, sort of the green economy was seen as, you know, the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre because it's going to work on nuclear reactors, or you know, that kind of thing. It's very high tech, seen as bringing in high paid jobs into the region, but in fact it's very few jobs, and that wealth doesn't spread at all to the city as a whole. So you know, it's difficult, but often as trade unions we're kind of a bit hooked to those because we've got a lot of members in, say, aviation, manufacturing, energy, you know, who are in quite well paid, but you know, well skilled positions, and it's hard for trade unions to sort of tear their attention away from that and think about the wider economy, the economy that Sarah's been talking about, food, you know, the food industry. But you know, when we want to reduce emissions, one of the very main things we need to do, for example, is reduce reduce our demand for energy by insulating homes, by, the Climate Jobs book tells us all these things. Insulate homes, provide decent transport and active travel possibilities, and change the food system so we waste less food, we grow more locally, we have less inputs and more priority for nature. And nature's got to be a feature in it. So it's like a shift in the way we think about the economy, which I think isn't going to happen unless we have that national climate service. And also valuing the co-benefits. This is my third reason, valuing the co-benefits of climate action. Because when we act on climate, we actually reduce that energy demand. We also make masses of benefits for health and wealth and equity. Transport, good public transport means less better air quality, less disease. It also means people can participate in society. They can get a job, they can go to college, they can go and join a club on the other side of town. And those things they can't do unless unless those services are there. An inclusive food system, it's got affordable, healthy food available in every neighbourhood. You look at the food deserts that we have in many of our cities. You could buy crisps and pop, but you can't really buy anything else. So tackling those issues and insulating homes brings a huge benefit in health benefits and mental health benefits as well, because people are really stressed by not being able to afford their bills. So, and these, there's some really strong benefits for women as well. And I say climate is a feminist issue, to be honest. So the fourth area that I've highlighted is skills and education. And what I recalled when I was thinking about this, why we need national climate, because it would actually educate its workers, because it would actually train its workers well. When I studied for my PGCE teaching qualification, I did so alongside NHS staff who were teaching in various parts of their jobs, but they weren't full-time teachers. They were a cleaning supervisor, a pharmacist, a theatre nurse, who had that opportunity to actually gain a higher qualification and actually become a teacher, a properly qualified teacher in their role. So that is the kind of thing we could do with the National Climate Service. We could actually give people careers instead of just jobs. And the final one, which again I'm echoing the internationalist perspective that's been, I'm really happy to hear it mentioned on today. Climate change is a desperate problem in every country. Actually, the UK is one of the least affected and one of the best able to deal with the situation, most able to act. But we need to look at kind of donor economics and recommend anybody to have a think about that. We need to supply human needs within the planetary boundaries. And that we need a global Green New Donut at Bristol. That's strange. With that thought, I'll leave that contribution. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks Jenny. Thanks everybody who spent some time thinking about that question. I know it's always horrible when I sit in panel and give you a question to respond to, that's not how I like it written, but I think that's been really good. I just wanted to give sort of 5 or 10 minutes if anybody wants to come in with any contributions, questions. Think there's points that's been missed in this round. You don't have to, or we can go to the next set of contributions. But a couple of people, okay.